Have you ever wondered what really happens on a spiritual level when someone who avoids intimacy loses someone who loves deeply? Not the surface level story, not the social media version where they look unbothered and move on in silence, but the invisible shift, the energetic rupture, the quiet unraveling that no one sees. When someone who protects themselves by pulling away loses someone who connects through feeling, something profound begins to move beneath the surface. It does not always happen immediately, it does not always look dramatic, but spiritually, the loss is not simple. It is not clean, it is not neutral, it is transformative. When an avoidant loses an empath, the first thing that appears is relief. And this relief feels real. It feels justified. It feels earned. The space that once felt overwhelming suddenly becomes wide and breathable. There are no emotional conversations to navigate, no intense eye contact that sees too much, no questions about feelings, no pressure to open up. For a moment, it feels like freedom, like finally exhaling after being held in a closeness that felt threatening. The silence feels powerful, the independence feels restored, the nervous system calms, and they may even tell themselves that this is proof they made the right decision, that love was suffocating, that distance is safer, that solitude is strength. But what they do not realize in that early relief is that they were not just stepping away from a person, they were stepping away from a source of emotional regulation. Empaths do something quietly powerful. They hold emotional space without demanding control. They sense unspoken tension. They soften environments. They absorb storms without announcing that they are doing it. And when that energy disappears, it leaves a vacuum. At first, the avoidant cannot name it. They just feel a slight restlessness beneath the calm, a subtle emptiness beneath the relief. The freedom feels different than expected. It feels lighter on the surface, but heavier underneath. Because spiritually, connection does not disappear simply because contact ends. There are bonds formed through vulnerability that linger beyond physical presence. When two people share silence, share fears, share unspoken pain, an energetic thread forms. And when the avoidant walks away, that thread does not instantly dissolve. It stretches, it thins, but it still exists. This is why random memories begin to surface. This is why certain songs suddenly feel heavier. This is why moments of stillness feel charged. They may not consciously miss the empath yet, but their soul feels the shift. The absence echoes. And then something even more uncomfortable begins to happen. The illusion of freedom starts to crack. During the day, distractions are easy. Work, friends, entertainment, noise. Avoidants are skilled at filling space with activity to avoid introspection. But at night, when everything quiets, something stirs. The nervous system that once felt relieved begins to feel unsettled. Thoughts replay. Conversations resurface. The empath's voice, calm and steady, echoes in memory. And what once felt suffocating now feels grounding in retrospect. This is the first spiritual shift, the realization that the freedom they fought for feels strangely lonely. They are not used to loneliness. They are used to controlled distance. But this is different. This is the absence of someone who truly saw them. And being seen, even when uncomfortable, is profoundly human. When that mirror disappears, it leaves a space where reflection used to exist. Because here is the deeper truth. Empaths mirror what others hide, not to expose them publicly, not to shame them, but simply by being present. When someone who avoids vulnerability is with someone who naturally feels deeply, their hidden wounds are quietly reflected back. Their fear of abandonment, their fear of engulfment, their belief that needing someone equals weakness. The empath does not create these wounds. They illuminate them. And when the avoidant loses that mirror, the wounds do not disappear. They just lose the external distraction. Without the empath's steady presence, suppressed emotions begin to rise. Feelings that were once softened by gentle reassurance now echo without comfort. Old childhood memories they never processed resurface unexpectedly. A tone of voice from the past, a moment of rejection they buried, a time they felt unseen. The empath had unknowingly been helping regulate those old ghosts. Now alone, the avoidant must sit with them without guidance. And that is where the real spiritual discomfort begins. Inside, a battle starts to form. The ego steps forward first. The ego says, you were right to leave. The ego says, love is dangerous. The ego says, you protected yourself. The ego insists that independence is superior to vulnerability. And for a while, the ego wins. It feels strong. It feels logical. It feels consistent with past patterns. But beneath that voice, quieter and harder to silence, the soul begins to whisper. The soul does not speak in arguments. It speaks in ache. It speaks in longing. It speaks in subtle regret that grows in stillness. The soul remembers how safe it felt to be understood without explaining every detail. The soul remembers the warmth of someone who did not run when emotions surfaced. The soul remembers moments of laughter that felt effortless. And this memory does not attack the ego aggressively. It simply lingers. And the longer it lingers, the more uncomfortable the inner conflict becomes. This is where the spiritual lesson intensifies. The avoidant must face a truth they have avoided their entire life. The fear was not the empath. The fear was intimacy itself. The fear was being known. The fear was losing control. And now that the empath is gone, the control feels hollow. Because what is control without connection? What is safety without warmth? At this stage, many avoidants attempt to fill the space quickly. They may talk to someone new, someone less emotionally intense, someone who does not ask deep questions. And at first, this feels easier. Conversations are lighter. Expectations are lower. There is no pressure to reveal hidden pain. But something feels flat. Surface level connections cannot replicate soul level resonance. They may laugh, they may enjoy company, but they do not feel that depth. And the absence of depth becomes noticeable in ways they did not expect. The empath's energy was not dramatic. It was grounding. It was stabilizing. It was like emotional gravity. And without gravity, everything feels slightly unanchored. This is why the avoidant may start experiencing waves of unexplained emotion, irritability without cause, sudden sadness, a heaviness that arrives in quiet moments. They may not consciously label it as grief, but spiritually, it is withdrawal. They are withdrawing from a source of emotional nourishment they did not realize they relied on. And here is where the deeper awakening begins. Losing someone who loved without trying to control forces reflection. It forces questions they once avoided. Why do I push away love when it gets close? Why does vulnerability feel threatening? Why does safety sometimes feel suffocating? These questions are uncomfortable. They challenge long-held beliefs, but they are also transformative because spiritual growth rarely begins in comfort. It begins in disruption. The empath leaving is not just a breakup. It is a mirror being removed. It is emotional support being withdrawn. It is an energetic shift that exposes unresolved pain. And at this crossroads, the avoidant faces a choice. They can double down on emotional distance, convincing themselves that connection is overrated. Or they can slowly soften, acknowledging that perhaps the discomfort they felt was not danger, but unfamiliar safety. For some, the awakening is slow. It arrives in quiet realizations months later. For others, it hits suddenly during an ordinary moment when a memory surfaces and the weight of loss becomes undeniable. But no matter the timing, something changes spiritually when an avoidant loses an empath. The illusion of invulnerability cracks, the belief that they are unaffected weakens, and beneath layers of defense, a simple human truth emerges. They cared, more than they admitted, more than they allowed themselves to feel. And that realization can be both devastating and liberating. Because once someone recognizes that their avoidance cost them something real, growth becomes possible. The pain becomes purposeful. The loss becomes a lesson instead of just an ending. Spiritually, this is not about punishment. It is about awareness. Awareness of patterns, awareness of fear, awareness of the depth they once rejected. When an avoidant loses an empath, what actually happens spiritually is not immediate karma. It is not dramatic collapse. It is a quiet internal unraveling that forces confrontation with self. It is relief turning into restlessness. It is ego battling soul. It is loneliness revealing hidden dependence. It is memories becoming sacred instead of suffocating. It is the slow understanding that love was not the threat. Avoidance was. And if you are watching this wondering whether they feel it, whether they realize what they lost, understand this. The spiritual shift does not always show externally, but internally, something moves, something cracks, something questions, and sometimes that question becomes the beginning of transformation. Because once awareness enters the room, it does not leave quietly. It lingers, it presses, it asks for deeper honesty. And this is where the next spiritual shift unfolds. When the empath truly detaches, when they stop reaching out, stop checking in, stop holding emotional space from afar, something changes energetically. The warmth that once surrounded the avoidant begins to withdraw. The subtle reassurance they could always feel in the background is no longer there. And even if they do not consciously admit it, they feel the absence immediately. Empaths do not just love with words, they love with presence. Their energy wraps around the people they care about, like invisible protection. When they finally decide to pull that energy back, it is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is quiet and firm. And the avoidant feels it like a sudden drop in temperature. The emotional climate shifts. The connection that once felt accessible now feels distant. And for the first time, the avoidant may sense that this loss is not temporary, it is real. This is the moment when abandonment wounds awaken. Avoidants are often described as fearing closeness, but beneath that fear lives something deeper, a fear of being left, a fear that if someone truly sees them, they will eventually walk away. And when the empath leaves for good, that hidden wound begins to throb. It is not always conscious at first. It shows up as irritation, as defensiveness, as sudden urges to reach out, but pulling back before doing so. It shows up as scrolling through old messages, as rereading conversations, as wondering if the empath thinks about them too. And here is the painful irony. The avoidant may have created distance to feel safe, but when the empath creates distance in return, safety disappears. Control is no longer theirs. They cannot predict the empath's emotions anymore. They cannot assume the empath will always be there. And spiritually, this loss of control forces humility. It forces the recognition that love was not something to be managed. It was something to be nurtured. As days turn into weeks, something else begins to surface. Grief. But not the loud kind. Not the dramatic tears in public. Avoidant grief is quiet. It hides behind routine. It hides behind productivity. It hides behind pretending nothing has changed. But late at night, when distractions fade, the weight presses against the chest. They remember small details. The way the empath listened without interrupting. The way they noticed subtle shifts in mood. The way they offered reassurance without being asked. These memories become sacred. They begin to feel rare, and rarity creates value. This is when the avoidant starts to understand something spiritually profound. Depth is not common. Emotional safety is not easy to find. Being loved without manipulation is not ordinary. And losing something rare creates a different kind of ache. It is not just missing a person, it is missing how they made you feel about yourself. Because empaths do something transformative. They see potential even when someone hides behind walls. They speak gently to wounds that were never healed. They believe in softness when the world taught hardness. And when that belief disappears, the avoidant is left alone with the version of themselves they tried to protect. Without the empath's steady gaze, self-doubt grows louder. The confidence that once felt stable begins to flicker. This is the spiritual vacuum. The absence of grounding energy creates a sense of internal imbalance. Other relationships may exist, but they feel surface level. Conversations feel lighter, but not deeper. Laughter exists, but it does not reach the same place in the chest. The avoidant may begin to notice that they feel spiritually disconnected, not just from the empath, but from themselves. And this is where the delayed emotional collapse can occur. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes even longer. But eventually the realization crystallizes. They lost someone who loved them in a way they did not fully understand at the time. And this realization can hit unexpectedly. It can arrive during a quiet drive, during a random memory triggered by a scent or a place. It can arrive when they hear someone else speak with kindness, and it reminds them of what once was. When that recognition settles in, it softens something hardened. The emotional numbness cracks, and with that crack comes pain. But pain spiritually is not punishment, it is awakening. It is the nervous system finally processing what was suppressed. It is the soul acknowledging truth after ego dominance fades. For some avoidants, this is the turning point. They begin to question their lifelong pattern of pulling away when things get real. They start connecting dots between past relationships and the same outcome. They recognize that every time someone got too close, fear took over. And now the cost of that fear is undeniable. The empath is gone. The lesson remains. At this stage, there are two paths, and this is the spiritual crossroads. The first path is hardening, convincing themselves that depth is overrated, that vulnerability leads to loss, that love is simply not worth the risk. This path feels safer in the short term. It reinforces old patterns. It keeps the ego intact, but spiritually, it leads to repetition. The same cycles, the same endings, the same quiet regret. The second path is softer but far more courageous. It requires admitting that fear drove decisions. It requires acknowledging that pushing someone away does not prevent pain, it delays it. It requires sitting with discomfort instead of escaping it. This path is growth, it is therapy, it is self-reflection, it is learning how to tolerate intimacy without panicking. It is choosing connection even when it feels unfamiliar. Not every avoidant chooses this path immediately, but losing an empath plants the seed, and seeds grow in silence. Even if they resist at first, even if pride blocks action, the memory of what was lost lingers like a quiet teacher. It whispers during future connections. It warns when they feel the urge to withdraw. It reminds them that love once felt safe, even if it scared them. Meanwhile, something else is happening energetically. The empath is healing. When empaths detach, they often go through their own transformation. They reclaim the energy they once poured outward. They focus inward. They grow. And as they grow, their presence changes. It becomes stronger, brighter, more self-contained. And the avoidant senses this shift even from afar. There is something deeply spiritual about watching someone you once had access to thrive without you. It triggers reflection. It challenges the narrative that you were the one in control. It exposes the truth that love is not guaranteed to wait, and this awareness can intensify regret. Not toxic regret, but clarifying regret, the kind that says, I misunderstood something valuable. And here's where the deepest transformation can occur. The avoidant may finally accept that their fear of being consumed was rooted in past wounds, not present reality. They may recognize that the empath was not trying to trap them, but to connect. That emotional intensity was not control, but closeness. That vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. When this understanding settles into the heart, something shifts spiritually. The avoidant begins to see themselves differently. Not as someone who simply prefers independence, but as someone who learned to equate intimacy with danger. And once that awareness becomes conscious, healing becomes possible. To you watching this, maybe you are wondering if they ever realize what they lost. Maybe you are the empath who felt unseen. Maybe you walked away because you were exhausted from loving someone who could not meet you emotionally. Understand this. Even if they never say it out loud, even if pride keeps them silent, something moved within them, something cracked, something questioned. Losing you was not just losing a relationship. It was losing emotional safety they did not know how to protect. It was losing a mirror that reflected their hidden wounds gently. It was losing a chance to grow alongside someone who saw their potential. Spiritually, that kind of loss does not disappear. It transforms, it teaches, it lingers. And whether they choose growth now or years later, the lesson remains etched into their emotional memory. Love requires courage, intimacy requires vulnerability, and running from depth does not eliminate longing. When an avoidant loses an empath, what actually happens spiritually is not immediate chaos. It is gradual awakening. It is ego softening into humility. It is loneliness revealing dependence. It is grief transforming into awareness. It is standing at a crossroads between repeating the past or rewriting it. And sometimes that awakening becomes the very thing that changes their future. And sometimes that awakening becomes the very thing that changes their future. Because once a person has tasted a love that reached beneath their defenses, they can never fully return to ignorance. They may try, they may distract themselves. They may convince their friends and even themselves that it was too much or not the right time. But deep inside, something has shifted permanently. The soul remembers what safety felt like, and that memory becomes both a comfort and a haunting. This is where the next spiritual layer unfolds. The avoidant begins to experience what can only be described as delayed grief. Not the immediate heartbreak that floods someone who leads with emotion, but a slow, creeping realization that arrives long after the separation. It might show up months later when life has seemingly stabilized. Out of nowhere, a wave of sadness hits. Not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy. A quiet recognition that something meaningful is no longer within reach. Avoidants are often skilled at postponing pain. They compartmentalize, they rationalize, they intellectualize their decisions. But grief does not disappear just because it is postponed. It waits patiently. And when it arrives, it carries not only the loss of the person, but the loss of what could have been, the future conversations, the shared growth, the emotional safety that was slowly being built. And this grief is different because it carries accountability. It whispers uncomfortable truths. It asks questions like, what if I had stayed? What if I had communicated instead of withdrawing? What if I had leaned into the discomfort instead of running from it? These questions do not attack the ego aggressively anymore. By this stage, the ego is tired. It has defended long enough. Now the soul is louder. Spiritually, this is the soul recognition moment. The moment when they finally understand that the empath's love was not ordinary. It was intentional. It was patient. It was courageous. And perhaps most painfully, it was real. They begin to realize that not everyone has the capacity to love that way. Not everyone will hold space without judgment. Not everyone will try to understand the silence instead of reacting to it. When that recognition settles in, something inside them softens in a way it never has before. The emotional numbness they relied on as protection starts to feel less like strength and more like isolation. They may begin to crave depth in future connections, only to discover how rare it truly is. Conversations feel transactional. Interactions feel temporary. They start comparing without meaning to, not because they are stuck in the past, but because their nervous system remembers what resonance felt like. This is also where the spiritual mirror flips. While the avoidant is slowly awakening, the empath is evolving. When empaths walk away for good, they do not just detach from a person, they detach from a dynamic. They begin reclaiming parts of themselves they gave away in the hope of saving someone else. They stop over-explaining. They stop over-giving. They learn boundaries that once felt impossible to enforce. As the empath grows stronger, their energy changes. It becomes self-contained, radiant, calm, without overextending. And the avoidant can sense this shift even without direct contact. Maybe they see a picture. Maybe they hear through mutual connections. Maybe it is just intuition. But they feel that the empath is no longer waiting, no longer hoping, no longer orbiting around them emotionally. There is something spiritually sobering about realizing that someone who once poured love into you is now pouring it into themselves. It confronts the avoidant with a quiet truth. Love is not an infinite resource you can take for granted. It must be nurtured. It must be reciprocated. And when it is neglected, it finds a new direction. At this stage, regret can deepen. But regret here is not about possession. It is about appreciation realized too late. They may replay moments where the empath reached out gently during conflict, moments where they were offered reassurance, moments where vulnerability was invited, not demanded. They see those memories differently now. What once felt overwhelming now feels generous. What once felt intrusive now feels caring. Perspective shifts, and with it, humility grows. Spiritually, humility is transformative. It cracks open the rigid identity of, I don't need anyone. It exposes the vulnerability beneath independence. It allows a new narrative to form. Maybe I do need connection. Maybe I was not suffocated. Maybe I was scared. And fear, once acknowledged, loses some of its control. This is the point where true spiritual growth becomes possible, not because they lost someone, but because they finally see themselves clearly. They see the pattern, the withdrawal when intimacy deepens, the discomfort when emotions intensify, the instinct to create distance when attachment forms. And instead of blaming the other person, they begin to take ownership. Ownership is powerful. It shifts the focus from what was done to them to what they participated in. It opens the door to change. Therapy may begin. Honest conversations with trusted friends may happen. Journals may fill with reflections they never allowed themselves to write before. Slowly, carefully, they start building a new relationship with vulnerability. But even if growth begins, the memory of the empath remains sacred, not idolized, not romanticized unrealistically, but honored. because they now understand that the empath represented an opportunity to learn intimacy in its healthiest form, an opportunity to break generational patterns, an opportunity to experience love without games or power struggles. And maybe you watching this are wondering whether they will come back once they realize all of this. The spiritual truth is more complex than a simple yes or no. Sometimes realization leads to reconciliation. Sometimes it leads to silent gratitude from afar. Sometimes it leads to transformation that benefits the next relationship instead. But regardless of the outcome, the impact of losing an empath is never neutral. It leaves an imprint, a before and after, a reference point for what depth feels like. Even if they never articulate it publicly, internally, they carry the lesson. They carry the awareness that love requires participation. That emotional safety is not weakness. That running from closeness only postpones the very connection they secretly desire. And here is where the final layer of these sections emerges, the spiritual truth beneath all of it. Losing an empath is not cosmic punishment. It is not destiny's revenge. It is a mirror held up by life itself. A mirror that asks, are you willing to evolve beyond your fear? Are you willing to confront the part of you that equates love with danger? Are you willing to soften instead of harden? For some avoidants, the answer becomes yes, slowly, imperfectly, but sincerely. They begin choosing conversations over silence. They begin expressing needs instead of suppressing them. They begin tolerating the anxiety that comes with closeness instead of escaping it. And every small step toward vulnerability is a spiritual rebellion against their old self. For others, the lesson takes longer, years sometimes, but the seed remains planted, and seeds, even buried deep, eventually seek light. So when an avoidant loses an empath, what actually happens spiritually is a slow unraveling of illusions. The illusion that independence means isolation. The illusion that emotions equal weakness. The illusion that pushing someone away protects the heart. Those illusions crumble quietly over time. In their place, awareness grows. Accountability grows. A longing for depth grows, and whether that growth reunites them with the empath or simply transforms who they become, the loss was never meaningless. It was catalytic. And if you are the empath who walked away, understand this deeply. Your love was not wasted. It was a teacher. It stirred something in them that may not fully awaken immediately, but it awakened nonetheless. You were a mirror, a lesson, a moment of truth in their emotional journey. Spiritually, that matters, because nothing that awakens the soul is ever wasted, even if it does not end the way the heart hoped, even if the timing was wrong, even if fear won in the moment. When an avoidant loses an empath, the story does not end with separation. It transforms into integration. And this final transformation is quieter than everything that came before it. It is not about regret anymore. It is not even about reconciliation. It is about identity. At some point, after the grief has softened and the ego has calmed, the avoidant begins to integrate the lesson into who they are becoming. They start noticing subtle shifts in themselves. They pause before withdrawing. They question their instinct to detach. They feel the urge to run when intimacy deepens, but now they recognize it as fear rather than truth. That recognition alone is spiritual evolution, because for most of their life, avoidance felt automatic. It felt justified. It felt like personality rather than protection. Losing an empath disrupts that illusion permanently. It reveals that what they thought was independence was often self-preservation, rooted in old wounds. And once that awareness exists, they cannot unknow it. This is where spiritual accountability matures into emotional courage. They may not become expressive overnight, they may still struggle with vulnerability, but something inside them has shifted from unconscious reaction to conscious choice. And that shift changes the trajectory of their future relationships. They begin craving emotional safety in a way they never admitted before. Not dramatic intensity, not chaos, but warmth, stability. Someone who listens instead of judges. Someone who stays instead of panics. And in those quiet desires, they recognize the empath's imprint. They recognize that what once felt overwhelming was actually grounding. Sometimes this realization brings them to a final internal crossroads. Not about reaching out, not about reclaiming what was lost, but about deciding who they want to be moving forward. Do they continue repeating cycles, protecting themselves so fiercely that love cannot enter? Or do they honor the lesson by becoming braver with their heart? For some, this becomes the moment they truly begin healing generational patterns. They trace their avoidance back to childhood dynamics, to caregivers who were distant, to environments where emotions were dismissed, to moments where vulnerability was punished rather than nurtured. They see that their fear did not begin with the empath. It began long before. The empath simply activated it. And when they understand that, blame dissolves. They stop framing the empath as too emotional or too much. They begin to see that the discomfort was internal, not external. That realization is humbling. It requires surrendering pride, but it also brings peace. Peace does not mean the absence of sadness, it means acceptance. Acceptance that they were not ready then, acceptance that love requires skills they are still learning, acceptance that losing someone meaningful can be a catalyst instead of a curse. And this is where the spiritual transformation completes itself. The avoidant no longer views the loss as something that happened to them, they see it as something that happened for them, not in a romanticized way, not in a way that erases the pain, but in a way that honors growth. Meanwhile, the empath continues evolving in their own direction. And here's the beautiful symmetry of it all. When empaths heal, they stop overextending to prove their worth. They stop trying to rescue emotionally unavailable partners. They learn to recognize red flags earlier. They honor their intuition instead of silencing it. Spiritually, they ascend into a higher standard of love. The avoidant senses this evolution even if they never speak again. And in sensing it, they understand something final and profound. Love is not about possession, it is about alignment. And when two people are misaligned in emotional readiness, separation becomes inevitable, not as punishment, but as protection for both souls. To you watching this, especially if you are the empath, you might still wonder if they think about you, if they feel the shift, if they carry the lesson. The answer, spiritually, is yes. Not always loudly, not always visibly, but deeply. The kind of love you gave does not evaporate. It imprints, it reshapes, it teaches long after the connection ends. And if you are the avoidant listening to this, perhaps recognizing yourself in these words, understand this with compassion. You are not broken. You are not incapable of love. You learned to survive in ways that once protected you, but survival strategies are not always sustainable in intimacy. And losing someone who loved deeply is not proof that you are doomed to repeat the past. It is proof that you are being invited to evolve. Spiritually, evolution rarely feels comfortable. It feels like loss. It feels like humility. It feels like confronting parts of yourself you would rather avoid. But on the other side of that discomfort is expansion, a wider emotional capacity, a stronger nervous system, a deeper understanding of connection. At the very end of this journey, what actually happens spiritually when an avoidant loses an empath is transformation through contrast. They learn the difference between solitude and isolation, between independence and emotional detachment, between intensity and intimacy. They begin to see that closeness does not equal control, that vulnerability does not equal weakness, that being seen does not mean being trapped. And once those distinctions are internalized, their future changes. They might still move slowly, they might still need reassurance, but they will approach love with more awareness than before. And awareness is the first step towards secure connection. The story then is not about who comes back, it is not about who wins, it is about who grows. The empath grows into boundaries and self-trust. The avoidant grows into accountability and emotional courage. Both are transformed, both carry lessons, both evolve in ways they could not have without the connection. In the end, losing an empath is not the end of love for the avoidant, it is the end of ignorance, the end of unconscious patterns, the end of believing that distance equals safety, and from that ending, something new can begin. And maybe that is the deepest spiritual truth of all. Some connections are not meant to last forever, they are meant to awaken forever.